Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Woo! We had a great time yesterday. We held Wayne and Juanita in our hearts, and we had 16 volunteers. We served 84 meals. We had music playing and just really good community, and so grateful for everybody answering the call to help. So thank you.
Our reading today is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. Now it is not necessary for me to write you about the ministry of the saints, for I know your eagerness, which is the subject of my boasting about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you may not prove to have been empty in this case, so that you may be ready, as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be put to shame, to say nothing of you, in this undertaking. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for this bountiful gift that you have promised, so that it may be ready as a bountiful gift and not as an extortion.
Titled Releasing God's Blessings. I love that title, and it is stewardship season, which we talk about blessings and we talk about our responsibility and our response to God, and this kind of way that we are in as Christians, this flow that we've learned to participate in. And this reminder that Jesus' gift of salvation, we live into a legacy that's not just our own. That we can get overwhelmed by what I have to do or what somebody else should do or how this is going to work. And we can sometimes forget the length and breadth of God's love and God's work and God's blessing in God's people. Interestingly, this is a much better title than what I probably could have titled the sermon, which unfortunately would have maybe been Biker Bars, Cold Holidays, and a Life of Abundance. Not a good title. Legacy of Blessings, way better. But as I started to ask myself the question that we're asking is, what do I think of legacies? What does a life of abundance mean? It's hard for me to come up with my own story, to think about who taught me about these things. Where did I hear about legacy and blessing? And my grandfather, I would hear these stories about in the 60s and 70s in South Texas, he ran an air conditioning company. And it doesn't seem all that important until you're in like a building and it's a little warm, right? And he would run this company, and he would go all over town and do this for businesses, but also individuals. Some of these businesses were of not great repute. You know? Biker bars, dance halls, country clubs, to be clear, hat, tipping, square dancing, not skinny tie golfing. Okay. Just to define country club for you. I probably could have heard a lot of stories about those things, right? My parents were not the type to like soften a story, right? We heard all kinds of things. But I don't remember any of those stories. I don't remember. And if I had been told any, I don't remember them, and my grandmother doesn't remember them either. Did I just hear a bird? That's awesome. The few stories I do remember were surrounded by what he did with the money he made from some of those businesses, from those relationships, when he would go and repair some big space, and then he would visit somebody on a side of town that he grew up in, right? He grew up in a really rough area, and he would intentionally go, especially during the holidays, and he would fix ACs for families that couldn't afford them. Not knowing they couldn't afford them, they would just call up Heitman and Heitman Air Conditioning, and they would show up. Those were the stories I think about when I think about a legacy of blessing, because he had to understand that somehow the blessings that he got for having this kind of like being willing to go to these places that other people wouldn't serve this is not like, these were places that people wouldn't go and work for, right? And he would because he knew he could build relationships, and those relationships could bless other people. Now, Texas, so there's a caveat, right? We're on this side of the river. Y'all know what cold actually means. We don't. And yet, Christmas or Thanksgiving, my grandfather, who we affectionately called Popo, would conveniently forget to write bills over and over again for people. He would just say, oh, I don't know why you didn't get that statement in the mail. Don't worry about it. Must have been something in the paperwork. It was never a boastful thing. It was never something that he bragged about. It was simply what he did. Now, to be clear, like, we weren't wealthy. It wasn't something that that my family, my mother growing up, was where there was so much that you could just hand out checks to people on the side of town he grew up in. It was what he could do with what he had. And I learned from him that abundance looks different for different people. Some of us have an abundance of our body. We can do work. We can physically go out and do things. Some of us have different types of abundance. And at that point in my grandfather's life, it happened to be ducts and financial things. One exceptional holiday, exceptional because it's Texas and it's cold. Those are exceptions. In South Texas, a family was more than out of pocket. He tells this story like it hurt him even as he got older. So he spent a lot more time than was necessary to do this ductwork. He spent time when he asked the teenager and the family if he wanted to help and learn what he was doing. Now, my grandfather wasn't trained in a kind of way where he could like give him a certificate to do this. It was simply, I'm going to spend the time. So that he said, sure. So he taught him how to do a certain amount of things, made sure they were more than, and then later, as the holidays approached, Thanksgiving, they had more than they needed. Christmas, they had more than they needed. I don't really know if my grandmother or my uncle or my mom knew all of that as it was happening. I can't even guarantee you that their Thanksgiving and Christmas was overflowing. But he made the opportunity. He had what he had, and he chose ways to distribute it. He looked at his life as abundant, partially because of how he grew up, but partially because he took the time to think about it, to consider it. The text we read this morning, surely, is kind of a simple text. It's about a collection. It's about money. It's about money for somebody else. It's almost, dangerously to say this, it's tempting to say it's kind of boring. The Jerusalem church needed some things. The Corinthians weren't well off, but they knew they could help. They knew that Paul's request was genuine and they could do something. They also knew their posture to this relationship they were building was about mending any wounds that might have been the case between Paul's ministry to the Gentiles and the church in Jerusalem. We talked about last week how Paul had just been kind of permitted to do the things that he was doing already and called to do. And then he loses a friend, and he loses this, and it was just really, really hard. This is where Paul's at, right? So to ask the church to serve, they said, maybe this is a way we can mend some wounds. It wasn't about surplus until you consider that surplus isn't necessarily the number on the bank account, but it's the heart that's attached to the friendship and the relationship to that account. The Greek word eager, the word that we interpret eager, is found more times in the Corinthians books than any other place in the New Testament. I thought that was really interesting. Paul's making a claim here. You guys are ferociously ready. You want to do the things that we ask of you. The other words that could be used, generous act, blessing, a thanksgiving, ministry, privilege, bountiful sharing. There was like 13 different ways that this could have been gone when you read it in the Jewish annotated New Testament. Just this section. The point is, eagerness isn't just eagerness. It's more than that. It's bigger, broader, it's full. They understood two ways of looking at how they lived in the world, what blessing was, what their legacy could be. It was both It was both an obligation, scary word, but it was out of, the obligation was a life formed out of God's abundance for them in their life. Oh Lord, look what you've done. I can sit at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning in southern Indiana and hear birds during church. Look, God, what you've done for me. Therefore, if there's a need, 16 people show up for loaves and fishes. There's a need, all of a sudden, and I am thankful to be doing my first stewardship sermon at this church because I've watched you over time. This is later in. Just respond right away. There's a need, here it is. It's already prepared. Your hearts are already tuned in. And this is what the church is building. They're building a habit of tuning in to God to say yes, to happiness. So I want you to think about someone who taught you something about happy giving. Not just giving with a smile. I'm going to give you a second. Do you have some people? Somebody in mind? This is where you nod and let me know I can keep going. I want you to think about somebody that those habits that they made in their life, that smile, that heart, it inspired you when giving was an option and available for you to do. You did it with joy in your heart as part of God's community. Keep that person in your mind for later. Perhaps this morning, a person couldn't show up. You didn't have examples. I shared in the very beginning of this sermon that it took me a minute to figure out how to come up with a story. Maybe you can think of a company that embodies this for you. Maybe there's someone that you donate to. There's even a church is not a singular person. There's a community that you, work at. I remember reading about Patagonia, the company that's very popular with clothing, finding out that one of their companies was doing terrible things, weren't paying fair wages, and were kind of ruining the reputation that Patagonia had. They gave away all the money for that year from that company. They restructured the company, and they made creative efforts to keep that from happening again. I look at that company differently. I had a different posture around people that had like the little like logo before, and now I think of it differently. Because they said we need to build not just a moment response, but a legacy. We need to change based on what's happened. So what company maybe inspires you? If that's what you're thinking of, think of that. Paul speaks to Jesus' generosity in a specific way. He talks about Jesus' generosity was in providing us salvation. When we think of salvation, sometimes we can think of moments or we can think of life over time. But this is the time where we can say what a blessing it is that salvation is offered, that we can live into the grace that is flowing throughout our entire life. That we can even say to ourselves, how can we be like Jesus in our own giving, in our own life, in our own way, stirring our hearts on. Paul urges the church that God is calling us to remember we've received grace in order to become agents of grace. That's the natural outflowing of, I've been overwhelmed with kindness. I've been overwhelmed with love and mercy and grace. It's just natural for me to share it. And when it's not natural, I've made habits in my life to share it again, to do it anyway. The other thing I think is important is Paul's equipping the church to do that. There's opportunities for them to learn how, like in what ways, like how do we do this? It's a valid question. Spiritual things are not like, oh, we just kind of turn into these wonderful people. Like we make habits. Methodists are great at this. That's why we're called Methodists. So what legacy do you think of when you think of the church? What comes to mind? When you think of the early Jesus movement, when you think of the church that you grew up in, when you think of the church you're sitting in, when you think of the church that's coming, when you think of, and I mention this often when I preach, when you think of the people that are not yet but will be in these seats, what do you think of? Do you think of worry and news reports of pastors taking advantage of people in wild spaces? Do you think of poverty being so big it's almost inconceivable that we could make a dent? Or do you think of a community that takes stock in how blessed it is in both spiritual and physical gifts and accepts their calling and then goes out and becomes a blessing in the world? How we think about our legacy is important. I'm often reminded that John Wesley defined perfection in two specific ways. You fully love God, and you fully love your neighbor. Now, he often mentioned that your neighbor was also your enemy. You know, the neighbor that doesn't mow their yard right, or doesn't take their trash out on time, or whatever. Even more than that, though. How do we know that we're being formed? Because we love God in a full way, and we love our neighbor in a full way. The world that we're in, as beautiful as it is and as hard as it is to see, needs people in it, needs you in it, to be hungry and thirsty for this kind of Christianity, this kind of love for God and neighbor. Love is central to having a heart and a habit of blessings, of releasing blessings. Wall Street. I want you to tell good stories. That's why I asked, how do you think about it? It's easy to slip into, and I know this. It's easy to slip into bad stories, but I want you to learn to tell good stories, because the world needs good stories, and you've got a lot of them. I see in the eyes and the mouths and the habits and the hands of folks in this church that always say there's more and there's enough. That those are not contradictory statements. There's enough and there's more. More to give to children in schools in other countries that need stipends. More to give to birthday parties for kids living in rough life scenarios. More to sitting with a child and teaching them to read and restoring in yourself how much you like to read and how hard it was for you back then. Stories of all of these things. Stories about a church that, when given the opportunity to do the smarter financial decision, to leave for the suburbs, you stayed. You asked yourself, God, what can you do with Wall Street as downtown changes and shifts? Who might our neighbors become? Let's stay, let's pray, let's keep our hands and our feet ready, and let's find out. And friends, we're still asking those questions, aren't we? We're still asking, how can Wall Street be good neighbors? This is because we're releasing this blessing. We're not in competition with one another. We're not shaming one another into any kind of giving. We're a living people who have been redeemed by grace and share blessings because we recognize God has given us those blessings. We have the opportunity to live in a life and legacy of generosity. Now, this series is titled Releasing God's Blessings. Now, there's a difficult word in that title. Hint, it's not God's blessings. Therefore, it is releasing. Oh, yeah, tricky word, right? It can be difficult. We're living in times, surely, and it would be silly of me not to mention it, of uncertainty and fear and worry. Now, the temptation for those times surely is to grasp, hold, store up, and make a circle smaller, to reserve. But we have been given a gift by Jesus that is not just about us, and it is not surely about grasping and holding and storing up. It's also not just about our souls. It's about our soil under our feet. It's about, surely, the money in our pockets, the time in our day. It's about the joy in our hearts. We come from a strong tradition where Wesley claims that the things you do with money are you make a bunch of it, you save a bunch of it, and you give a bunch of it away. And he adds always happiness. So are you happy this morning? Does this time of year come up and you say, I'm happy. Salvation makes me joyful. I'm not just mournfully overwhelmed, I'm excited. Wesley's use of happiness shows up almost in equality with all of the really hard things in his sermons. If you've ever read the Blue Book, it's a rough read. It's a collection of John Wesley's sermons, but I'm in a class that challenges us to underline or highlight every time he uses the word happiness. Wesley calls us into loving Jesus in holiness and happiness. So may we be giving our time, service, food, shelter, love, and yes, money to call ourselves, one another, and this world into holiness and happiness because we're joyful of what God is doing. Amen.